Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Midnight Files. Tonight, you'll hear 13, a true story about crime, disappearance, and miraculous survival. If you like it, hit like, subscribe, so you can follow more fascinating stories, and let me know where you're listening and what time it is. Before we begin, please check your door locks, and maybe take a look out the window. Okay, let's get started. Outside, the rain had begun to fall. At first, just a few scattered drops tapping lightly on the window pane. Then it grew heavier, more consistent, until the sound of the rain became a white curtain, swallowing up all other sounds. The streets turned into small rivers, and the night sank into an eerie silence. It was on a night like this, at the Silver Dragon restaurant, that a group of men was sitting down for a meal. They had no idea that in a few hours, their dinner choice would result in the complete rewriting of the National Criminal Code. But before we delve into that story, let's rewind time a little. In the year 2000, the city of Kecskemét was a place caught between two worlds. For decades, it had been a quiet hub in the heart of Hungary, known for its sprawling orchards and the production of a very famous apricot brandy. But after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the sudden shift to a market economy created a vacuum. This void was quickly filled by men who had spent the previous decade learning how to navigate the black market. They were smart, they were ambitious, and they were incredibly violent. By the turn of the millennium, these groups had evolved into sophisticated syndicates that controlled almost everything. The most lucrative business for these organized crime groups was the illegal oil trade. In the 1990s, the Hungarian government had a two-tiered tax system for fuel. There was one price for home heating oil and a much higher price for diesel fuel used in cars. The only difference between the two was a chemical dye. The mafia realized that if they could simply bleach the dye out of the cheaper heating oil, they could sell it at the diesel price and make a staggering profit. This became known as the oil bleaching scandal, and it generated billions of Hungarian forints for the various gangs fighting for control. By the early months of the year 2000, the tension between these rival groups had reached a breaking point. One specific faction was led by a man named Sandor, who was trying to expand his influence from the capital city of Budapest down into the southern regions. He was a veteran of the underworld who understood that in this business, your reputation was your only real currency. If someone disrespected you or moved onto your turf, the response had to be swift. He had been hearing rumors that a rival group was planning to push him out of the hospitality and security sectors in Kecskemét. On the evening of February 11th, 2000, the atmosphere inside the Silver Dragon restaurant was deceptively normal. This was a popular spot for the local elite, known for its dim lighting and its heavy, traditional Hungarian dishes. Around 8 o'clock that night, a table of 5 men sat near the center of the dining room. They were talking loudly, clinking glasses of red wine, and enjoying plates of spicy goulash. To any other patron in the room, they looked like successful businessmen celebrating a deal. But in reality, they were high-ranking members of Sandor's organization. They felt safe in the Silver Dragon because it was considered neutral territory. In the unspoken rules of the Hungarian underworld, you didn't conduct business hits in public family restaurants. It brought too much heat from the national police. However, the rivals they were dealing with had decided that the old rules no longer applied. While the 5 men were laughing and planning their next move, 2 dark sedans pulled into the parking lot outside. The engines were left running, and several men wearing heavy coats and dark ski masks stepped out into the cold, drizzling rain. Inside the restaurant, the waiter was just approaching the table to ask if anyone wanted dessert. Suddenly, the heavy wooden front doors were kicked open with such force that they bounced off the interior walls. The diners looked up, expecting a rowdy group of late arrivals, but their expressions quickly turned to pure terror. The masked men were carrying Soviet-made submachine guns. Without saying a single word or issuing any demands, they leveled their weapons at the center table. The silence of the restaurant was instantly shattered by the deafening roar of automatic gunfire. The lead assassin squeezed the trigger and did not let go until his magazine was empty. The sound was so loud that people in the kitchen thought a boiler had exploded. Shell casings began to rain down onto the tiled floor, making a metallic clicking sound that was barely audible over the screams of the other patrons. The 5 men at the table had no time to react. They were pushed backward by the sheer force of the bullets, their chairs flipping over as the table itself was splintered into pieces. Glass shards from wine bottles flew through the air like lethal confetti. One of the intended targets tried to crawl toward the bar, leaving a dark trail on the floor, but a second gunman stepped forward and fired a final burst into his back. The attack was over in less than 30 seconds. The assassins turned and ran back out into the rain, the tires of their sedans screeching as they sped away from the scene. Inside the Silver Dragon, the air was thick with the smell of spent gunpowder and the metallic scent of fresh blood. The survivors began to emerge from under their tables, their clothes covered in dust and debris from the shattered walls. When the first responders arrived a few minutes later, they were met with a scene that looked like a military skirmish rather than a civilian crime. 3 of the men at the center table were dead where they sat. 2 others were clinging to life, their breathing shallow and ragged. But the most horrifying part of the discovery was that the gunfire had been so indiscriminate that several bystanders had been hit by stray rounds. An elderly woman sitting 3 tables away had been grazed by a bullet, and a young waiter was slumped against the wall holding a shoulder wound in total shock. The Kecskemét bloodbath sent shockwaves through the entire country of Hungary. For years, the public had known that the mafia existed, but it had always felt like something that happened in the shadows or on remote industrial sites. Now, the violence had spilled over into a public space where innocent people went to eat dinner. The national media picked up the story immediately, and the pressure on the government to act became unbearable. People were tired of the corruption, the oil scandals, and the feeling that the criminals were more powerful than the actual police force. In response to the massacre, the Hungarian government took a radical step. They realized that their current laws were woefully inadequate for dealing with organized crime groups that operated like corporations. They looked to the United States and their Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act for inspiration. Within months of the shooting, a series of new laws was drafted that allowed prosecutors to charge individuals for simply being members of a criminal organization, even if they hadn't personally pulled a trigger. This was the birth of the famous Hungarian mafia trials. The investigation into the Silver Dragon shooting eventually led to the arrest of dozens of high-profile underworld figures. The police used the new legislation to flip lower-level members, who were suddenly facing 30 years in prison instead of just 5. These informants began to tell the story of a massive network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the energy industry. The trial was one of the most guarded events in the history of the country, with snipers stationed on the roofs of the courthouse to prevent any attempts at a rescue or a retaliatory hit. Ultimately, the men who ordered the hit at the Silver Dragon were sentenced to life in prison. The restaurant itself never truly recovered its reputation and eventually closed its doors, serving as a grim monument to the night that the Hungarian underworld finally went too far. The event changed the legal landscape of Eastern Europe forever, proving that sometimes it takes a tragedy of immense proportions to force a government to stand up to the monsters living in its midst. The quiet orchards of Kecskemét returned to their peaceful state, but the memory of the gunfire still lingers. While the streets of Hungary were being cleaned up by new legislation thousands of miles away in South Africa, a different kind of predator was preparing a much more subtle and personal method of execution. In the city of Pretoria, a wealthy businessman was about to receive a package that looked like a celebration but contained a death sentence. This killer didn't need a submachine gun or a masked crew. They only needed a single corkscrew and a victim who enjoyed the finer things in life, leading to a mystery that would baffle the best forensic minds in the Southern Hemisphere. In the high-altitude city of Pretoria, South Africa, during the month of October in the year 2000, a man named Jacobus van der Westhuizen believed he was untouchable. He was a titan of industry, a man whose name carried weight in the boardrooms of the Transvaal. His home was a sprawling estate protected by electrified fences and a private security detail that patrolled the perimeter 24 hours a day. He felt entirely secure. Jacobus, or Cobus, as his friends called him, had spent 30 years building an empire in the logistics and export business. He was a man of habit and refined taste, often spending his evenings on his veranda, looking out over the manicured gardens while sipping a glass of expensive brandy. He lived with his wife and 2 teenage children, and to the outside world, he was the picture of South African success during a very turbulent era. On a particularly warm Tuesday afternoon, a courier vehicle pulled up to the main gate of the Van der Westhuizen estate. The security guard checked the manifest and saw that a package had been sent specifically for Cobus. It was a heavy, rectangular wooden crate with no return address, only a small card attached to the twine. The card simply said, "In appreciation of our continued partnership," written in elegant, professional calligraphy. The guard performed a routine sweep for explosives or metallic devices, but the crate passed without incident. He hand-delivered the box to the kitchen, where the housekeeper placed it on the marble island. When Cobus returned home later that evening, he was intrigued by the gift. He used a small pry bar to pop the lid, revealing a layer of protective straw, and, nestled inside, a dust-covered bottle of rare 1975 vintage wine. Cobus smiled, thinking it was a gesture from a Japanese shipping firm he had recently signed a massive contract with. He admired the label, noting that this specific bottle was worth thousands of dollars and was almost impossible to find on the open market. He decided he wouldn't share it just yet. He wanted to savor it after his wife and children went to bed as a private celebration of his most recent corporate victory in the business world. Around 11 o'clock that night, the house became quiet. Cobus retreated to his study, a room lined with dark mahogany bookshelves and heavy velvet curtains. He pulled out a crystal wine glass and a high-end corkscrew. As he twisted the metal spiral into the cork, he noticed it felt a bit softer than he expected for such an old vintage, but he figured the storage conditions hadn't been perfect. He pulled the cork with a very satisfying pop. He poured a generous amount of the deep red liquid into his glass. The aroma was complex, but there was a faint, sharp chemical undertone that caught the back of his throat. He chalked it up to the wine being corked or having aged past its prime, but he didn't want to waste such a prestigious gift. He took a large, confident gulp, letting the liquid coat his tongue before swallowing. Within seconds, his physical life would change forever. Almost immediately, a burning sensation erupted in the back of his throat, sliding down his esophagus like molten lead. He dropped the glass, and it shattered against the hardwood floor, splashing red stains across the rug. He tried to cough, to expel whatever he had just ingested, but his muscles weren't following his brain's instructions. A wave of intense nausea hit him, followed by a dizzying spin that made the entire room tilt on its axis. Cobus reached for the edge of his desk, but his fingers were numb. He felt a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead, and his vision began to tunnel until he could only see the flickering light of the desk lamp. He tried to call out for his wife, but his vocal cords were paralyzed. He collapsed into his leather chair, his chest tightening as if a massive weight was being pressed down on his lungs, making every single breath a desperate battle. What Cobus didn't know was that the wine had been meticulously tampered with by a professional. Using a surgical syringe, someone had injected a highly concentrated dose of an organophosphate agricultural poison through the cork. This specific toxin was used on industrial citrus farms to kill stubborn pests by attacking their nervous systems. In a human being, it causes a total systemic collapse that looks, at first glance, like a sudden heart attack. For 20 minutes, Cobus lay in his chair, fully conscious but unable to move or speak. He watched the clock on the wall, the second hand ticking away the final moments of his life. He felt his heart racing at a terrifying speed before it began to skip beats. The agony was internal, a fire raging through his nerves while his body remained perfectly still. Eventually, the paralysis reached his diaphragm, and he simply stopped breathing in the dark. The next morning, his wife found him. The initial assumption by the local police was that the stress of the business world had finally caught up to him. He was 54 years old, and a heart attack wasn't out of the question. However, the responding detective noticed the shattered wine glass and the strange chemical smell lingering in the air. He ordered the bottle and the remains of the glass to be sent to the forensic lab in downtown Pretoria. The toxicology report came back 3 days later and sent a shockwave through the South African business community. The concentration of the poison in the wine was high enough to kill 20 grown men. This wasn't a random act of violence or a botched robbery, it was a cold, calculated assassination. The police began to look into everyone who had a motive to see Jacobus van der Westhuizen removed from his position of power at the logistics company. They started with his business partners, searching for signs of corporate espionage. They found that Cobus had been planning to fire 2 of his top executives for embezzlement just weeks before his death. Both men had access to the industrial chemicals used in the shipping containers, but they both had solid alibis for the day the package was sent. The investigation then turned toward the courier service, but the driver had been a legitimate employee. The break in the case came when the police tracked the origin of the vintage wine bottle. It hadn't been bought at an auction or a high-end liquor store. It had been stolen from a private collection belonging to Cobus's own brother-in-law, a man named Peter, who was deeply in debt. Peter had known about Cobus's love for rare wines and had used that passion as a weapon. He had spent months researching the exact poison that would leave the body quickly. Peter's motive was as old as time: inheritance. He knew that if Cobus died without a will being updated, a significant portion of the family estate would pass to his sister, who Peter could easily manipulate for money. He had carefully drained a small amount of wine, replaced it with the toxin, and used a heat gun to reseal the wax over the cork so it looked factory fresh. He had even hired a random person on the street to act as the courier delivery man. Peter was eventually arrested after the police found the specific type of agricultural poison in his garage, hidden behind some old paint cans. The case became a landmark in South Africa for its sheer cruelty and the sophisticated nature of the crime during a year where most murders were committed with firearms. Cobus had built a fortress to keep the world out, never realizing that the greatest threat to his life would come in the form of a vintage gift. As the detectives dug deeper into Peter's history, they discovered he had been meticulously documenting his plan in a series of encrypted files on his home computer. He had spent hours on early internet forums researching the lethal dosages of various pesticides, specifically looking for ones that were colorless and could be masked by the heavy tannins of a Cabernet Sauvignon. His coldness was terrifying to the investigators, who were used to crimes of passion. During the trial, the prosecution played a recording of Peter talking to a friend about how easy it would be to get rid of someone if you just knew their habits. He had exploited Cobus's predictable routine of solitary drinking, knowing exactly when the poison would be consumed and how long it would take for the house to go quiet. The jury was shown the syringe and the wax seals, physical evidence of a brother-in-law who had transformed into a predatory ghost. The impact on the van der Westhuizen family was catastrophic. The children, who had once viewed their uncle as a mentor, had to testify against him in open court, recounting the times he had visited their home while the murder weapon was likely already being prepared. The trial revealed a dark side of the South African elite, where the struggle for wealth could turn a family dinner into a scouting mission for a future crime scene, ending in a lifetime of regret. Cobus's wife eventually sold the estate in Pretoria, unable to walk past the study without seeing the ghost of her husband slumped in his chair. The story of the poisoned wine became a cautionary tale in the Transvaal, a reminder that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones we invite through the front door. It was a year of transition for the country, but for one family, time had stopped the moment that cork was pulled from the rare vintage bottle. The city of Pretoria eventually moved on, but the forensic techniques developed during the investigation set a new standard for toxicology cases in the region. The poison gift remains a chilling example of how high-level intelligence can be twisted into a tool for absolute evil. But as the world turned toward the new millennium, the darkness seemed to be manifesting in even stranger ways across the globe, shifting from the calculated to the truly bizarre. In the northern reaches of Spain, the salt air of the Bay of Biscay usually brings a sense of calm to the people of Gijón. But in the year 2000, that air was thick with a different kind of tension. While a businessman in Africa was falling victim to a chemical trap, the women of Gijón were being stalked by a man who appeared to be straight out of a gothic horror novel, someone who believed he was no longer entirely human and needed sustenance. This individual was not interested in the slow crawl of agricultural toxins or the complex politics of inheritance. He was hunting for something far more essential to life, driven by a deep psychological break that would lead him to do the unthinkable to total strangers under the cover of the Mediterranean night. As the sun set over the Spanish coast, a new kind of terror was about to emerge from the shadows, leaving the local police baffled by his motives. The betrayal of a family member is a wound that never truly heals, leaving a legacy of silence in the grand halls of the Pretoria estate. But while some killers use the tools of science and chemistry to hide their tracks, others are driven by a much more primal, terrifying urge that defies all logic. In the cobblestone alleys of Gijón, the transition from civilian to predator was happening in a way that would soon make international headlines for its sheer insanity. The coastal city of Gijón sits along the rugged northern edge of Spain, where the Atlantic Ocean crashes against ancient stone walls and the thick mist often rolls in to swallow the narrow cobblestone streets. In the year 2000, this picturesque location was gripped by a series of events that seemed better suited for a gothic horror novel than the local evening news. The citizens were used to the usual rowdiness of the port, but they were not prepared for the predator. As the sun dipped below the horizon on a damp Thursday evening in March, a 24-year-old woman named Elena was walking home from her job at a local library. She enjoyed the solitude of the late hours, finding the sound of her own footsteps on the pavement to be a rhythmic comfort. She turned down a dimly lit alleyway that served as a shortcut to her apartment, unaware that someone had been watching her from the darkness of a recessed doorway for over an hour. Elena heard a scuffing sound behind her and instinctively quickened her pace. She didn't want to look back, fearing that acknowledging the presence would make it more real. But before she could reach the end of the alley, a figure lunged out of the gloom. There was no demand for her purse and no flash of a metallic blade. Instead, she felt two strong hands grip her shoulders with terrifying force, pinning her against the cold, damp bricks of a nearby building. The attacker didn't speak. He leaned in close, and for a fleeting second, Elena thought he was going to whisper something into her ear. Instead, she felt a sharp, searing pain in the side of her neck. It wasn't the stinging sensation of a knife, but rather the unmistakable pressure of human teeth sinking deep into her flesh. She let out a muffled scream as she felt the man's hot breath against her skin and the sickening sensation of him beginning to drink. With a burst of adrenaline born from pure terror, Elena managed to plant her heel on the man's foot and shove him away. The attacker stumbled back, seemingly surprised by her resistance, and disappeared into the labyrinth of shadows before she could get a clear look at his face. Elena ran until she reached a well-lit plaza where she collapsed in front of a group of startled teenagers. Her collar was soaked in a dark fluid that was definitely not rainwater. At the hospital, the medical staff was baffled by her injuries. They had treated plenty of assault victims, but they had never seen a wound quite like this. There were two distinct puncture marks on her jugular vein that were ragged and deep. The doctor noted that the area around the bite had been cleaned of excess fluid, as if the perpetrator had stayed long enough to consume what he had drawn. The police were called, but they didn't even know how to classify the crime. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time, the victim was a 30-year-old woman named Maria who was unlocking her front door after a night out with friends. The attack was identical. A sudden ambush, a firm grip on the shoulders, and a brutal bite to the neck. Maria described her assailant as a man who seemed remarkably calm, almost clinical in his approach. He didn't seem interested in her jewelry or her money. He was only focused on the pulse in her throat. The local tabloids picked up the story, and soon the Vampire of Gijón became a household name. Panic began to spread through the northern provinces of Spain. Women stopped walking alone at night, and sales of heavy scarves and high-collared jackets skyrocketed despite the warming spring weather. The local law enforcement agency formed a special task force, flooding the streets with undercover officers who were instructed to watch for anyone behaving strangely in the dark. The break in the case came in late April when a patrol unit spotted a man loitering near a public park that had been the site of several recent sightings. He was dressed in a conservative, expensive wool coat and wore thick-rimmed spectacles that gave him the appearance of a university professor or a dedicated scholar. When the officers approached him for questioning, he didn't try to run. He simply stood there with a vacant, distant expression on his pale face. In his pockets, the police found a small kit that sent a chill through the station. It contained a set of surgical gloves, a small bottle of antiseptic, and a hand-drawn map of the city with several locations circled in red ink. The man was identified as Marco Antonio Del Pino, a highly educated individual with a degree in philosophy and no prior criminal history. To his neighbors, he was a quiet, polite man who spent most of his time reading in the archives. When the investigators obtained a warrant to search Marco's apartment, they were prepared for a mess, but what they found was a chilling display of order. The living room was filled with thousands of books on ancient mythology, occult rituals, and the history of hematology. But the most horrifying discovery was made in the kitchen. When a detective opened the refrigerator, he found rows of glass jars filled with a dark, viscous liquid that was later confirmed to be human blood. Each jar was meticulously labeled with a date and a series of cryptic notes about the flavor profile and the energy levels he felt after consuming the contents. There was also a detailed diary tucked into a drawer beneath the silverware. In the pages, Marco described a slow, agonizing transformation that he believed was turning him into a creature of the night. He wrote about a thirst that could not be quenched by water and a sun that felt like it was burning his soul. Marco claimed that he suffered from a condition known as clinical lycanthropy, or more specifically, Renfield's syndrome. He believed that by consuming the life force of others, he could achieve a state of higher consciousness and escape the mundanity of human existence. He didn't view his victims as people, but as vessels of a sacred substance that he required for his survival. His cold, intellectual justification for the violence was more terrifying than the acts themselves. The subsequent trial became a media circus in Spain, sparking a national debate about the intersection of psychiatric care and criminal responsibility. The defense argued that Marco was suffering from a profound delusional disorder and belonged in a high-security mental institution. The prosecution, however, pointed to the meticulous planning and the antiseptic kit as evidence that he knew exactly what he was doing and was simply a calculated, sadistic predator. During the proceedings, Marco remained eerily detached, often staring at the ceiling or muttering to himself in a language that no one in the courtroom could identify. He seemed more annoyed by the interruption of his studies than remorseful for the trauma he had inflicted on the women of Gijón. He was eventually found guilty, but the court ruled that his mental state required him to be confined to a specialized psychiatric wing within the Spanish prison system. The case left a permanent scar on the psyche of the city. For years afterward, the alleyways where the vampire had lurked were avoided by locals after dusk. The story served as a grim reminder that the most monstrous urges can sometimes be hidden behind the facade of a gentleman and a scholar. Marco's archives were confiscated, but the mystery of what truly triggered his descent into such a primitive and bloodthirsty obsession remains a topic of study for many. The damp streets of Spain eventually returned to their normal rhythm, but the sense of security had been fundamentally altered. While the residents of Gijón were looking over their shoulders for a man in a wool coat a world away in the tropical waters of Australia, another mystery was unfolding. This one didn't involve a predator in the shadows, but rather a complete and total absence of life in a place where everything seemed perfectly in its place. Out on the Great Barrier Reef, the sun was shining down on a luxury yacht that was gently bobbing in the turquoise waves. To a passing plane, it looked like a scene from a vacation brochure, but as the authorities drew closer, they realized that something was very wrong. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood on the deck, and no footprints in the sand. There was only a table set for a meal that would never be eaten, leaving the world to wonder. The silence of the open ocean can be just as terrifying as the dark alleys of a European city, especially when the inhabitants of a vessel seem to have vanished into thin air. In the year 2000, the discovery of this ghost ship would launch one of the most intensive maritime investigations in history, searching for a family that had disappeared without leaving a single clue behind, as if the sea itself had decided to reach up and pull them into the deep. The Great Barrier Reef is one of the most breathtaking natural wonders on the planet, stretching over 1,400 miles along the coast of Queensland, Australia. It is a place of vibrant coral and crystal clear water that usually signals paradise. But in the early months of the year 2000, a surveillance plane flying over the outer reef spotted something that felt completely out of place against the backdrop of the turquoise sea. Floating near a treacherous section known as Old Reef, the pilot noticed a 12-meter catamaran named the Kaz Two. From the air, nothing seemed amiss. The white sails were hoisted and flapping gently in the breeze, and the vessel was moving at a steady pace. However, as the pilot circled lower, he realized that there was not a single person visible on the deck. He attempted to make radio contact multiple times, but he only received the hiss of static. A Coast Guard vessel was dispatched from Townsville to intercept the drifting yacht. When the maritime officers pulled alongside the Kaz Two, they were struck by an eerie, heavy silence. They boarded the ship with their weapons drawn, expecting to find a scene of a struggle or perhaps a medical emergency. Instead, they found a situation that felt like a frozen moment in time. The engine was still idling quietly, creating a low hum that vibrated through the deck. In the galley, the table was set for a meal. There were 3 bowls of pasta that had clearly been served recently, as the food had not yet begun to mold in the tropical heat. Next to the plates were 3 sets of silverware and 3 glasses of water, still half full. A laptop computer sat open on a nearby bench, its screensaver still active, flickering with a soft blue light. It looked as though the crew had simply stepped into another room for a second. The officers moved toward the sleeping quarters, but the beds were neatly made and completely empty. There were no signs of blood, no bullet holes, and no evidence that anyone had tried to fight off an intruder. The life jackets were still hanging in their designated storage lockers, and the small emergency dinghy was still secured to the rear of the catamaran. It was as if 3 grown men had simply evaporated into the humid Australian air without a trace. The yacht belonged to 3 experienced sailors, Derek Batten and 2 brothers, Peter and James Tunstead. They had set off from Airlie Beach just a few days prior, planning to sail around the northern tip of Australia to Western Australia. They were all in their 50s and 60s, known for being cautious and methodical. They weren't risk takers, and they certainly weren't the type of men to abandon a perfectly functional ship in the middle of the ocean. As the news of the ghost ship hit the mainland, the Australian authorities launched a massive search and rescue operation that covered thousands of square miles of the Coral Sea. Dozens of planes and boats crisscrossed the area looking for any sign of the missing men. But the ocean is vast, and despite the favorable weather conditions, they found absolutely nothing. No debris, no floating clothing, and no bodies were ever recovered from the reef. The investigation then turned to the technical data found on board the yacht. The GPS system showed that the vessel had been traveling on a steady course until it suddenly began to drift in a random pattern. The timing of this shift coincided almost perfectly with the moment the meals would have been served. This led investigators to believe that whatever happened to the crew occurred with such extreme speed that they didn't even have time to shout for help. Several theories began to circulate among the maritime community. Some suggested that the men had been intercepted by modern-day pirates who were operating in the remote reaches of the reef. However, this didn't explain why all the expensive navigation equipment and the men's wallets were still on board. A pirate would have stripped the boat of its valuables. Others suggested a freak weather event, but the sea had been remarkably calm on that specific day. One of the more terrifying possibilities explored by the forensic team involved a phenomenon known as a man overboard chain reaction. They hypothesized that one of the men might have fallen into the water while trying to free a tangled fishing line. In the panic, the second man might have jumped in to save him, followed by the third. With the sails up and the engine in gear, the yacht would have continued to move away from them faster than they could swim. Imagine the horror of those 3 men, bobbing in the open ocean, watching their only means of survival slowly disappear over the horizon. The Great Barrier Reef is beautiful, but it is also home to some of the most dangerous predators on Earth, including tiger sharks and box jellyfish. If they couldn't catch the boat, they would have been left at the mercy of the elements and the creatures lurking beneath the surface of the shimmering turquoise water. The investigation in the year 2000 eventually reached a stalemate. The coroner's report concluded that the men were likely deceased, but the exact cause of their disappearance remained undetermined. The Kaz Two was towed back to port, where it sat as a grim reminder of how quickly the sea can turn on those who traverse it. The mystery of the three sailors who left their dinner steaming on the table became a staple of Australian maritime lore. To this day, the families of Derek, Peter, and James have no closure. They are left with the image of a perfectly set table and a running engine, a haunting tableau of a life interrupted by a force that no one can explain. The ocean kept its secrets, and the ghost ship of the Great Barrier Reef remains one of the most perplexing disappearances of the new millennium, leaving investigators to wonder if there was something more sinister at play. While the Australian coast was haunted by the image of an empty boat, the southern city of Adelaide was dealing with a much more physical and visceral kind of horror. The year 2000 marked a turning point in one of the most gruesome criminal cases in the history of the continent. While the sea swallowed the crew of the Kaz Two, the earth beneath a small town north of the city was giving up secrets that had been buried in heavy plastic barrels. The transition from a mystery on the water to a nightmare in a bank vault would grip the nation in a way that nothing else could. As the details of the Snowtown legacy began to emerge in the courtroom, the public realized that the monsters they feared weren't just in the shadows of the reef. They were living in plain sight, led by a charismatic man who had convinced his followers that they were doing the world a favor by cleaning up the trash. The sun baked the asphalt of the northern suburbs of Adelaide until the air shimmered with a thick heat that made it hard to draw a full breath. In the year 2000, the city was bracing itself for a judicial event that would peel back the skin of the community to reveal something truly rotten underneath. While the world was looking toward the future of a new century, the people of South Australia were being forced to look into the very darkest pits of the human soul. At the center of this legal firestorm was a man named John Bunting, who had spent the better part of a decade convincing those around him that he was a righteous vigilante. He was a large man with a steady gaze and a way of speaking that made his followers feel like they were part of an exclusive club. He didn't use flashy weapons or complex schemes. Instead, he used the weight of his own personality to crush the will of anyone who came into his immediate orbit. John had gathered a small group of men, including Robert Wagner and James Vlasakis, and convinced them that the local government was failing to protect the innocent from predators. He created a list of people he deemed to be undesirable, individuals he claimed were a drain on the resources of the neighborhood. He called his mission a social cleansing, and he spoke about it with a terrifying level of calm that made the most horrific acts sound like a necessary chore. By the time the year 2000 arrived, the preliminary hearings were starting to shed light on the mechanics of their operation. The group would lure their victims to various rental houses under the guise of friendship or a need for assistance. Once the door was locked, the atmosphere would shift from welcoming to predatory in a heartbeat. The victims were often kept alive for days, subjected to mental and physical agony that was recorded on cassette tapes. The core of their operation eventually moved away from the city and into a small, dying town called Snowtown, located about 90 miles to the north. There, John had found an abandoned stone building that used to function as a state bank. It was a sturdy, windowless structure with a heavy steel vault that offered the kind of privacy that a man like John required. He saw the vault not as a place for money, but as a permanent storage locker for his victims. Inside that vault, the group placed 8 heavy-duty plastic barrels. Each one was filled with a mixture of chemicals intended to accelerate the decomposition of the remains. For months, the townspeople walked past the old bank, unaware that the air inside was thick with the stench of a dozen lives that had been snuffed out in the most brutal way imaginable. The sheer scale of the operation was unlike anything the Australian police had ever encountered in their history. The year 2000 was when the survivors and the families of the missing finally had to face the reality of what had happened in that bank. The trial revealed that John Bunting had not just killed these people, he had stolen their identities. He forced them to record messages for their relatives, saying they were moving away to start over. And then he used their bank cards to withdraw their meager welfare payments to fund his own dark and twisted lifestyle. During the court proceedings, the prosecution played some of the audio tapes that had been recovered from the group's various residences. The sound of John's voice, cool and collected as he issued commands to his terrified captives, sent a visible shiver through the jury. It was the sound of a man who felt absolutely no empathy, a person who had completely disconnected from the concept of human suffering in his pursuit of absolute power over his victims. One of the most shocking revelations of the 2000 trial was the involvement of James Vlasakis, who had essentially been groomed by John from a young age. James became the star witness for the state, detailing how the group would sit around in the evenings, eating pizza and watching movies, while their victims were bound and gagged in the next room. The mundane nature of their daily lives made the cruelty of their actions feel even more unbearable. The town of Snowtown became synonymous with the Barrels, a legacy that the local residents fought hard to overcome. They were a tight-knit community of just a few hundred people who suddenly found their home at the center of a global media frenzy. Reporters from every continent descended on the main street, pointing cameras at the old bank building and interviewing anyone who would speak. The silence of the town had been replaced by a roar of public outrage. John Bunting and Robert Wagner sat in the dock throughout the year 2000, often showing a complete lack of remorse as the details of their crimes were read aloud. They would whisper to each other and occasionally smirk when a particularly gruesome detail was mentioned by a witness. It was clear to everyone in the room that they didn't see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as heroes who were being persecuted for doing the dirty work. The trial also highlighted the failure of the social systems that were supposed to look after the vulnerable. Many of the 11 victims were people who lived on the margins of society, individuals who could disappear for weeks without anyone raising an alarm. John had specifically chosen them because he knew their absence wouldn't be questioned by the authorities. He exploited the loneliness of his targets, using the promise of a community to lead them into a trap. By the end of the hearings in 2000, the full scope of the Snowtown legacy was etched into the public consciousness. It wasn't just a story about a serial killer, it was a story about how a charismatic leader can warp the reality of those around him until the unthinkable becomes normal. The barrels in the vault were a physical representation of the rot that can grow when hatred is allowed to fester under the guise of a moral crusade in a small suburb. The final verdicts wouldn't come until later, but the year 2000 was the time when the mask was finally ripped away. The people of Australia were left to grapple with the knowledge that such evil had been operating in their midst for nearly a decade. The bank in Snowtown was eventually stripped of its fixtures and the vault was sealed, but the memory of what was found inside continues to haunt the collective memory of the entire southern continent. As the heavy doors of justice began to close on the monsters of South Australia, another chapter of history was being settled in the humid jungles of Southeast Asia. While the court in Adelaide was listening to tapes of modern-day predators, the legal system in Cambodia was finally reaching a point of closure for a tragedy that had begun years earlier. The shadows of the past were long, stretching from the bank vaults of Snowtown to the mountain peaks. In the Cardamom Mountains, the air is thick with the scent of damp earth and tropical blossoms, a place where the line between life and death has often been blurred by war. In the year 2000, the world was waiting for the final word on a group of travelers who had vanished into the green abyss. The law of the jungle was being replaced by the law of the land, as the remnants of a fallen regime were brought out into the light. The transition from the cold, calculated murders in an Australian suburb to the brutal executions in a Cambodian forest shows that the nature of evil is the same, regardless of the landscape. Whether it is driven by a twisted ideology or the desperate remnants of a civil war, the result is always a void that can never be filled. As the year 2000 progressed, the stories of those who never came home were finally being told to their conclusion. The Cardamom Mountains in Cambodia are a dense emerald labyrinth where the canopy is so thick that the sun barely reaches the forest floor. For decades, this region was a no-go zone, a final stronghold for the remnants of the Khmer Rouge, who refused to lay down their arms after the Civil War ended. In the year 2000, the world's attention turned to this humid wilderness as the Cambodian government finally moved to provide a grim legal closure. 6 years earlier, in 1994, three young Westerners, Jean-Michel Briquet from France, Mark Slater from Britain, and David Wilson from Australia, were traveling on a train through the southern province of Kampot. They were young, adventurous, and full of the kind of wanderlust that makes you believe you are invincible. They had no idea that their journey was being watched by a group of soldiers hiding in the tall grass near the railway tracks. The train was ambushed by a guerrilla unit led by a high-ranking Khmer Rouge commander named Sam Bith. The soldiers used heavy explosives to derail the locomotive and then opened fire on the passengers. In the chaos, the three backpackers were separated from the other locals and marched at gunpoint deep into the heart of the Cardamom Mountains. For months, they were held as pawns in a high-stakes political game between the guerrillas and the government. The kidnappers demanded a ransom of $50,000 in gold for each man, but the situation quickly deteriorated as the Cambodian army began to shell the mountain hideout. Communication was sporadic and terrifying. The families of the three men waited in agony, receiving occasional proof-of-life notes that spoke of the harsh conditions and the constant fear of execution. By late 1994, the mountain went silent, and the trail went cold for a long time. It wasn't until the year 2000 that the full, horrifying truth was laid bare in a Phnom Penh courtroom. The investigation had finally gathered enough evidence to bring the commanders to justice. Witnesses who had defected from the Khmer Rouge began to describe the final days of the three backpackers. They revealed that as the government troops closed in, the order was given to eliminate the baggage. The three men were led to a shallow pit in the jungle. The trial in 2000 provided the specific details that the families had dreaded for over half a decade. Mark, Jean-Michel, and David were not killed in a crossfire. They were executed with blunt force and small arms fire to save on ammunition. Their remains had been recovered years prior, but it was during the year 2000 that the legal system officially identified Sam Bith and his subordinates as the men who had personally signed the death warrants. Sam Bith had spent years living in a comfortable villa, protected by his status as a former general who had supposedly defected to the government side. But the outcry from the international community and the persistence of the victims' families forced the Cambodian authorities to act. In the year 2000, the image of the aging commander sitting in the dock, his face showing no emotion, became a symbol of the transition from a lawless past to a more stable future. The proceedings were a landmark for Cambodian justice, representing the first time high-level Khmer Rouge officials were held accountable for specific crimes against foreign nationals. The court heard testimony about how the men had tried to stay positive, teaching each other their native languages while shackled to wooden poles in the mud. The sheer resilience of the human spirit in the face of such absolute darkness was the only light in an otherwise tragic story. By the end of the year 2000, the sentencing of the commanders brought a sense of finality to the shadow zones of the Cardamom Mountain. The tourism industry in Cambodia, which had been decimated by the news of the kidnappings, began to slowly recover as travelers felt the era of the jungle warlord was finally over. The mountains remained emerald and beautiful, but they would always carry the weight of the three young men who never made it home. The legacy of the backpacker murders served as a warning that even in a world that was becoming more connected, there were still places where the old rules of violence applied. While Cambodia was cleaning up the remnants of its civil war, the northern plains of Russia were witnessing the birth of a different kind of predator. This was not a soldier of a fallen regime, but a man who found his own private war in the middle of a crowded city park in Moscow. As the jungle canopy of the Cardamom Mountains finally yielded its secrets to the investigators, the urban woods of Bitsevsky Park were just beginning to hide theirs. The year 2000 was a bridge between the old terrors and the new, shifting from the organized brutality of a guerrilla unit to the solitary, chilling obsession of a man who viewed his fellow citizens as pieces on a game board. The transition was subtle, but the body count was just as high. In Moscow, the transition to a new millennium was marked by political upheaval and a police force that was stretched to its absolute limit. In this atmosphere of distraction, a man was wandering the paths of a local forest, looking for the lonely and the marginalized. He didn't need a ransom or a political cause. He only needed a hammer and a victim who was willing to sit down for a drink. The Wolf of Moscow was beginning his most active phase. The story of the backpackers ended in a courtroom in 2000, providing justice after years of silence. But in the snowy reaches of Bitsevsky, the story was only just beginning to accelerate. The contrast between the two was stark. One was the end of a war, the other was the start of a private massacre. As the world moved into the summer of 2000, the silence of the Russian woods was being broken by sounds that no one was yet listening for. The Bitsevsky Park in the southern part of Moscow is a massive expanse of dense woodland, covering over 4,000 acres of birch and pine trees. To the millions of people living in the surrounding apartment blocks, it is a vital escape from the concrete suffocations of the city. But in the year 2000, the park was beginning to earn a much darker reputation. People were starting to go missing, disappearing into the green shadows as if they had never existed at all. Moscow, at the turn of the millennium, was a city in total chaos. The Second Chechen War was raging, the economy was unstable, and the police force was struggling to keep up with a massive surge in organized crime and political corruption. Because of this, when a lonely pensioner or a homeless man vanished from a park bench, it barely registered as a statistic. The authorities assumed they had simply moved away or fallen victim to the harsh Russian winter and the heavy drinking. Among the thousands of people who visited the park daily was a 26-year-old grocery store clerk named Alexander Pichushkin. To his co-workers and neighbors, Alexander was a quiet, unremarkable man who kept to himself. He was often seen playing chess with the elderly men who gathered at the park's entrance, showing a keen intellect and a patient, methodical nature. No one suspected that this hobby was actually the blueprint for a terrifying personal mission. Alexander had made a secret vow to himself. He wanted to kill 64 people, one for every square on a chessboard. He had committed his first murder back in the early 90s, but the year 2000 marked the moment he stepped into his most active and aggressive phase. He moved through the woods with a chilling sense of purpose, treating the park like his own private hunting ground where he could play out his darkest fantasies without any fear of interruption. His method was disturbingly simple and exploited the deep loneliness that many people felt in post-Soviet Russia. He would approach men who looked like they had nowhere else to go, often elderly individuals or those struggling with alcoholism, and strike up a friendly conversation. He would tell them that his beloved dog had died and was buried deep in the woods, and he would ask them if they would accompany him to the gravesite to share a final toast of vodka. Most of these men, grateful for the human connection and the offer of free alcohol, would follow him willingly into the dense thickets far away from the main walking paths. Once they reached a secluded spot, Alexander would produce a bottle of vodka and 2 glasses. They would sit together on a fallen log or a patch of moss, talking about their lives. As soon as the victim let his guard down and began to feel the effects of the drink, Alexander would strike. He didn't use a knife or a gun, which he felt were too impersonal and loud. Instead, he carried a heavy carpenter's hammer concealed in his jacket. With a single, devastating blow to the back of the head, he would incapacitate his victim. He believed that he was performing a service, releasing these people from a life of misery. He would then dump the bodies into the various sewer manholes that were scattered throughout the park, letting the underground pipes carry them away. In the year 2000, Alexander's pace accelerated dramatically. He was no longer just a casual killer. He was a predator who had found his rhythm. He kept a secret journal at home where he recorded each game, crossing off a square on his handmade chessboard every time he successfully disposed of a body. The police were completely unaware that a serial killer was operating in the heart of the city, even as the number of missing persons reports continued to climb. One of the reasons he was able to operate for so long was his choice of victims. By targeting the marginalized and the forgotten, he ensured that no one would go looking for them with any real urgency. He understood the flaws in the Russian bureaucratic system better than the officials themselves. He knew that a missing man with no family and a history of drinking would be low on the priority list for a police force that was already buried under thousands of active murder files. During the summer months of 2000, the Wolf of Moscow became more daring. He started to target people he actually knew, including some of his coworkers from the grocery store. He felt a sense of divine power every time he led someone into the woods, knowing that he held the key to their life or death in his hand. His arrogance grew with every square he marked off, convinced that he was far more intelligent than the detectives who patrolled the streets. The discovery of the bodies wouldn't happen for years, but the year 2000 was the foundational period for his reign of terror. It was the year he moved from being a man with a dark impulse to a systematic executioner. The silence of Bitsevsky Park during those winter nights was heavy, hiding the sounds of a hammer and the final breaths of men who just wanted a friend. Alexander would walk back to his apartment, clean his boots, and go to work the next morning. The Chessboard Killer would eventually become one of the most prolific serial murderers in history, but in 2000, he was just a ghost in the birch trees. His story is a grim reminder of how easily the vulnerable can be preyed upon when a society is too distracted to notice its own missing pieces. As the sun set over Moscow, Alexander would look out his window at the park, already planning his next move, seeing the entire city as a game he was winning. While the wolf was stalking the quiet woods of Russia, thousands of miles to the west, the city of Berlin was facing a much more public and chaotic form of violence. In the spring of 2000, the German capital's transit system became the stage for a series of terrifying attacks that happened in broad daylight. This wasn't a hidden game played in the forest. It was a visible, frantic nightmare that unfolded in front of hundreds of commuters on the S-Bahn. The transition from the slow, methodical luring of victims in Moscow to the lightning-fast strikes in the Berlin subway shows the different faces of madness. One killer wanted to remain hidden forever, while the other seemed to be driven by a desperate need to lash out at the world in the most jarring way possible. As the doors of the silver trains slid open and shut, a phantom was moving through the crowds, leaving a trail of blood on the yellow safety lines. In the year 2000, the sound of the tracks in Berlin began to symbolize danger instead of progress. People who were simply trying to get to work or school found themselves in the crosshairs of a man who didn't want their money or their conversation. He only wanted to leave a mark. The hunt for the trolley slasher would grip the city, forcing the authorities to flood the stations with guards, trying to catch a shadow that vanished before the train even left the platform. Berlin is a city that never really stops moving, and at the very heart of that movement is the S-Bahn. These are the massive, iconic yellow and red trains that snake through the German capital, carrying hundreds of thousands of commuters every single day from the suburbs into the bustling city center. In the spring of the year 2000, the S-Bahn was the pride of Berlin's infrastructure. It was efficient, it was clean, and above all, it was considered safe. But in April of that year, that sense of security evaporated in an instant. It started on a Tuesday afternoon, during the peak of the rush hour. A young man named Thomas was standing near the sliding doors of a crowded carriage, listening to music on his headphones. As the train pulled into the Friedrichstrasse station, he felt a sharp, hot sensation across his cheek. He thought someone had accidentally bumped into him with a sharp edge of a bag or maybe a piece of luggage. He reached up to touch his face, and when he pulled his hand away, it was completely covered in a thick, bright red fluid. He looked around in a daze, trying to identify what had happened, but the doors had already opened, and a sea of people was pouring out onto the platform. Thomas collapsed onto a nearby bench as the adrenaline wore off and the pain began to set in. He had a deep, surgical slash that ran from his ear all the way down to his jawline. The medical staff at the hospital were horrified. They told the police that the wound had been delivered with incredible precision and force, likely using a modified box cutter or a professional-grade scalpel. The attacker hadn't stayed to watch. He had struck and then vanished into the crowd before the victim even knew he was bleeding. It was a phantom strike, executed with such speed that none of the other passengers in the crowded carriage had seen a thing. 3 days later, it happened again. This time, it was a woman in her late 30s who was sitting quietly reading a book. As the train decelerated for the Alexanderplatz station, a man walked past her and seemingly stumbled. She felt a cold sting on the back of her neck. By the time she realized she was seriously injured, the man had jumped through the closing doors and was gone. The pattern was starting to emerge, and it was a pattern of pure, unadulterated chaos. Panic gripped the city of Berlin. The local newspapers began calling the attacker the S-Bahn Slasher, and the Transit Authority was forced to deploy hundreds of additional security guards and undercover police officers across the entire network. People stopped looking at their phones or their books. Instead, they stood with their backs against the walls of the carriages, eyes darting between every passenger, waiting for the next strike to come from the shadows. The investigation was a nightmare for the Berlin police. The year 2000 was a time before the city had high-definition cameras on every corner and inside every train car. They had to rely on grainy, black and white footage from the station platforms, showing thousands of blurry figures moving in and out of the light. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, but the descriptions of the attacker were always conflicting. Some said he was tall, others said he was short. The only thing that stayed consistent was the weapon. The forensic experts determined that the blade was being held in a specific way, tucked between the fingers to allow for a quick, swiping motion. This suggested that the attacker was not a professional assassin or a trained soldier, but someone who had practiced this specific movement until it became muscle memory. He was treating the commuters like stationary targets in a very twisted and private exercise. The breakthrough finally came in late April when a plainclothes officer noticed a man behaving strangely at the Oskrit station. The man wasn't waiting for a specific train. He was riding the lines back and forth, staring intently at the floor and muttering to himself. Every time the train went through a tunnel, he would press his ear against the glass of the window, his eyes rolling back in his head as if he were listening to a secret broadcast from the tracks. When the officer approached him, the man didn't resist. He simply reached into his pocket and handed over a heavy, industrial utility knife that had been sharpened to a razor edge. He was identified as a 42-year-old man who had been living in a small, cluttered apartment near the railway tracks for years. He had a long history of severe schizophrenia and had recently stopped taking his medication, believing that the world had become too loud and crowded. During his interrogation, he told the detectives that the hum of the tracks had started talking to him. He claimed that the vibration of the S-Bahn trains was a language that only he could understand, and the tracks were demanding a sacrifice. He believed that by bleeding the city, he could quiet the noise in his head and bring balance back to the universe. He didn't feel any malice toward his victims. In his mind, they were just instruments used to satisfy the rails. He explained that he would wait for the exact moment the brakes were applied, using the screeching sound of the metal on metal to mask the sound of his movements. He would strike just as the doors were about to open, giving him a 3-second window to escape into the station before the victim could react. It was a chillingly logical system developed by a mind that was otherwise completely disconnected from reality. He was the ghost in the Berlin transit machine. The trolley slasher was eventually committed to a high-security psychiatric hospital, and the attacks on the S-Bahn stopped as quickly as they had begun. But the scars on the city remained. For the rest of the year 2000, the residents of Berlin were much more cautious on their daily commutes. The hum of the tracks, which had once been a comforting white noise of urban life, now reminded them of the man who had listened to the metal and decided to strike. The transition from the public transit terror of Germany to the coastal mysteries of the United States shows how a single year can be defined by vastly different types of darkness. While Berlin was recovering from a madman's spree, the shores of Massachusetts were being revisited by a ghost from the past. A cold case that had remained unsolved for 26 years was suddenly pushed back into the light by a confession that seemed too horrific to be true. In the year 2000, a convicted serial killer sitting in a prison cell decided to tell a story about a woman found in the dunes of Provincetown. This wasn't a crime of transit or a sudden mental break. It was a deep, buried secret that involved a landscape of sand and a killer who claimed to have left more than just one body behind. The Lady of the Dunes was about to have her story reopened, leading investigators on a frantic search for the truth. As the sun set over the Atlantic, the shifting sands of Cape Cod were holding on to secrets that had been forgotten by almost everyone except the man who put them there. The year 2000 was a year of reckoning for Hadden Clark, a man whose mind was a labyrinth of genuine horror and calculated lies. The search for a lead in one of America's most famous unidentified victim cases was about to take a turn that no one in the FBI could have predicted. The sand dunes of Provincetown, Massachusetts are a place of shifting beauty and haunting silence. For decades, they held a secret that became one of the most famous cold cases in American history. On a summer day in 1974, a young girl found a body in the dunes. The woman had been brutally murdered, and her hands were missing, making identification impossible. She became known as the Lady of the Dunes, a ghost that haunted the local police for 26 years. In the year 2000, a man named Hadden Clark was sitting in a prison cell in Maryland. He was already serving time for the murders of a 6-year-old girl and a 24-year-old woman. Hadden was a deeply disturbed individual who had a history of cross-dressing and claiming that a female alter ego named Kristen was responsible for his crimes. He was a master of manipulation, but in the year 2000, he decided to start talking about his past in a way that shocked FBI. Hadden claimed that he was responsible for the death of the Lady of the Dunes. He told investigators that he had encountered her on the beach back in the mid-70s and that he had buried her in a specific spot near the water. While serial killers often make false confessions for attention, Hadden provided details about the crime scene that had never been released to the public. He spoke about the way the body was positioned and the specific type of clothing she had been wearing. This confession in the year 2000 triggered a massive forensic operation on Cape Cod. Detectives and federal agents descended on the dunes with ground-penetrating radar and a team of cadaver dogs. They weren't just looking for the Lady of the Dunes, whose identity was still a mystery, but for other potential victims that Hadden claimed to have buried across the East Coast. The search was a race against the tide and the shifting sands that threatened to hide the truth. As the excavators dug into the earth, they didn't find a body at the specific site Hadden pointed out, but they found something else that was just as chilling. They unearthed a collection of jewelry and personal items that Hadden had buried in a plastic bucket. There were rings, necklaces, and even a set of car keys. When the police traced these items, they realized they belonged to several other women who had gone missing over the previous 2 decades, linking him to a spree. The investigation in 2000 revealed that Hadden Clark was a much more prolific predator than anyone had realized. He had traveled extensively along the Atlantic coast, leaving a trail of trophies buried in secret locations. His confession regarding the Lady of the Dunes remained a point of contention. Some believed he was lying to get a transfer to a better prison, while others were convinced he was the killer. Regardless, the 2000 search brought some small closure. Hadden's mind was a dark and cluttered place, filled with the memories of those he had taken. He enjoyed the power he held over the investigators, leading them on a wild goose chase through the woods and beaches. He would describe the smell of the salt spray and the sound of the wind, painting a picture of a monster who felt at home in the wilderness. The year 2000 was a turning point where his secret life was finally being mapped out by the federal authorities. Provincetown police had spent decades looking at photos of the unidentified woman, hoping for a break. When Hadden started talking in 2000, they thought the mystery was finally solved. He claimed that the victim was a teenager he had met while working at a nearby restaurant. He even drew sketches of the location where he supposedly left the murder weapon. Every detail he provided sent the agents back out into the sand, shovels in hand, hoping to find the smoking gun. The search area was vast, covering miles of protected parkland where the dunes reach heights of 50 feet. The wind constantly reshapes the landscape, meaning a burial site from the 70s could be buried under dozens of feet of sand by the year 2000. Despite the environmental challenges, the team stayed on site for weeks. They used sifting screens to examine every bucket of dirt, looking for a tooth or a bone fragment that could provide a definitive DNA match. While the search for the Lady of the Dunes remained inconclusive that year, the discovery of the bucket of jewelry was a massive victory for cold case units. It proved that Hadden was a pack rat who couldn't let go of his crimes. He kept these items as a way to relive the moments of violence. The bucket contained over 200 pieces of scrap and jewelry, suggesting that the number of his victims was much higher than the 2 he had been officially convicted of killing. The psychological profile of Hadden Clark that emerged in 2000 was one of a man who was deeply disconnected from reality, but possessed a cunning survival instinct. He would often speak in the third person, referring to Kristen as the one who pulled the trigger or swung the blade. This made it difficult for the police to pin him down on specific facts. He used the Lady of the Dunes mystery as a bargaining chip, dangling the truth in front of the feds to get perks. By the end of the year 2000, the investigation into Hadden's claims in Massachusetts had reached a stalemate. Without a body, they couldn't charge him for the murder in the dunes. However, the items recovered from the sand were used to build cases in other jurisdictions. The year 2000 became the year that Hadden Clark was solidified in the public mind as one of the most dangerous and deceptive serial killers of the era, a man who literally buried his past. The Lady of the Dunes would remain an unidentified ghost for another 22 years until genetic genealogy finally gave her a name in 2022. But the efforts of the investigators in the year 2000 were not in vain. They proved that even the most cold and buried secrets can be brought back to the surface if you are willing to look deep enough. The dunes of Provincetown kept their primary secret for a while longer, but the monster had been exposed. The memory of the 2000 search still lingers in the minds of the older residents of Cape Cod. They remember the sight of the white tents and the federal vehicles parked along the coastal road. It was a reminder that even in a place of such natural beauty, a human being can commit acts of unimaginable cruelty. The shifting sands eventually covered the excavation sites, but the legacy of Hadden Clark and his bucket of trophies remained a dark stain on the coast. As the forensic teams packed up their gear in Massachusetts, the world's attention was shifting south toward a much more immediate and violent conflict. While the dunes were holding on to ghosts from the 70s, the Amazonian interior was witnessing a bloodbath fueled by the greed of the new millennium. In the lawless reaches of Brazil, the search wasn't for bodies from the past, but for the precious metal that lay buried beneath the muddy riverbanks of the jungle. In the state of Para, the year 2000 was a time of absolute chaos for the independent miners known as garimperos. These men worked in the informal mines, searching for gold in a landscape that was often called the Green Hell. There was no government presence, no police, and no protection for the weak. As the sun beat down on the dense canopy, a dispute over a gold-rich claim was about to turn into a massacre that would be remembered as the Golden Death. The transition from a methodical forensic search on an American beach to a chaotic resource war in a Brazilian jungle highlights the diversity of crime in the year 2000. One was driven by a killer's need to taunt the authorities with his past, while the other was driven by a desperate, violent pursuit of wealth. As the month of August began, a group of gunmen was moving through the thick undergrowth of the Amazon, headed toward a remote mining camp. They weren't there to talk or to negotiate, they were there to seize control of the Garimpo by any means necessary. The miners at the camp were mostly poor men from the surrounding villages, hoping to find enough gold to feed their families. They had no idea that they were standing on land that a local power broker had already claimed for himself. The violence that was about to unfold would be swift and merciless, leaving a trail of bodies in a ravine far from the law. The story of the Golden Death in 2000 serves as a grim example of what happens when natural resources are located in regions where the law cannot reach. Much like the dunes of Cape Cod, the Amazon jungle has a way of swallowing up the evidence of crimes. But while the sands of Provincetown eventually gave up their secrets, the mud of the Brazilian interior often keeps them forever. The massacre in the Garimpo was a cold reminder of the price of gold. As the gunmen drew closer to the mining camp, the sounds of the jungle were the only warning the miners had. The air was thick with the scent of damp vegetation and the hum of insects, a sensory experience far removed from the cold prison cells of Maryland. The year 2000 was a year of extremes, where the most sophisticated forensic science met the most primitive and brutal forms of violence in the pursuit of power and wealth across the entire globe. The massacre at the gold mine in Brazil was just one of many that occurred in the lawless interior during that time, but it stood out for its sheer brutality. The gunmen didn't just kill the miners. They wanted to send a message to anyone else who dared to work the claim. The year 2000 was a year of blood and gold in the Amazon, where the line between a businessman and a murderer was often non-existent. The jungle would soon have new secrets to keep. The world moved on from the story of Hadden Clark and the Lady of the Dunes as new tragedies took over the headlines. But for those who study the history of crime, the year 2000 remains a significant chapter. It was a year where the past and the present collided, where killers confessed and new massacres were committed. The shifting sands of the American coast and the dense green of the Brazilian jungle were both part of a much larger, darker narrative. The families of the women whose jewelry was found in the bucket finally had a name to attach to their grief. In the year 2000, the cold case files were dusted off and updated with the information gathered from Hadden's confession. Even though he was already in prison, the knowledge that he had been caught in his lies gave them a sense of justice. The search for the truth is often a long and painful process, but it is one that never truly stops for the police. Hadden Clark would continue to make headlines for years, often changing his story or claiming to have information about other high-profile cases. He remained an enigma to the psychologists who studied him, a man who lived in a world of his own making. The year 2000 was the peak of his influence over the legal system, a time when his words could launch a multi-agency search across a state. He was a monster who craved the spotlight as much as he craved the kill. The Lady of the Dunes lead in the year 2000 might not have provided a name for the victim, but it provided a face for the evil that had been lurking in the sand. It showed that no matter how much time passes, the drive to solve a mystery remains constant. As the forensic teams eventually withdrew from Provincetown, they left behind a community that was forever changed by the knowledge of what had been buried in their beautiful, shifting dunes for so long. The transition to the final story of the Brazilian Garimpo reminds us that crime is not just a local issue, but a global one. Whether it is in the quiet towns of Massachusetts or the lawless reaches of the Amazon, the struggle between good and evil is a constant. The year 2000 was a witness to both, providing a legacy of unsolved mysteries and brutal truths that continue to challenge our understanding of the human condition in the modern digital age. Deep within the Brazilian state of Para, the Tapajós River carves a muddy brown path through a forest so dense that the canopy blocks out 90% of the sunlight. This is the interior of the Amazon, a place where the geography is defined by the absence of everything civilization provides. There are no paved roads, no telephone lines, and most importantly, there is no police presence. In the year 2000, this region was the setting for a modern-day gold rush. The city of Itataituba served as the final gateway to this wilderness. It was a frontier town overflowing with dreamers, desperados, and the independent miners known as garimpeiros. These men were not employed by major corporations. They were individuals who spent their meager savings to charter small planes into remote jungle landing strips. From there, they would hike for days to reach informal claims where they hoped the red earth would finally reveal a vein of gold. One such group of 7 miners had established a camp near a remote creek bed in August of 2000. They were led by a man named Manuel, who had spent 20 years chasing the glimmer of precious metal across the continent. They lived in primitive conditions, sleeping in hammocks under blue plastic tarps and working 14 hours a day in knee-deep mud. They used pressurized hoses to blast away the riverbanks, sifting through the slurry for tiny flecks of wealth. For weeks, the group had been unusually successful. They had discovered a pocket of gold that was far richer than anything they had seen in years. In the lawless interior, however, success is a double-edged sword. Word travels fast in the Amazon, moving along the river systems and through the small supply outposts. By mid-August, their discovery had reached the ears of a local land grabber who operated a much larger illegal mining operation about 50 miles away. This man, known locally as a guerrillero, believed that anything found in that sector of the forest belonged to him by right of force. He didn't bother with legal paperwork or mining permits. His authority came from the group of armed men he kept on his payroll. These were professional gunmen who were paid to ensure that independent miners stayed off his claimed territory. When he heard about Manuel's lucky streak, he decided it was time to collect a very bloody tax. On the morning of August 14, 2000, the 7 miners were finishing their breakfast of dried beans and coffee. The air was already heavy with humidity, and the sound of the gasoline-powered water pumps was echoing through the trees. Because of the constant roar of the machinery, they didn't hear the sound of the brush breaking just beyond the perimeter of their camp. They had no idea that 10 men carrying automatic rifles were surrounding their position. The lead gunman stepped out from behind a massive mahogany tree and fired a single shot into the air. The miners froze, their hands dropping to their sides. Manuel tried to step forward to negotiate, offering a portion of their gold in exchange for being left alone. But the gunmen weren't there to negotiate. They had been ordered to clear the site completely to ensure there would be no witnesses to the land grab. They opened fire with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. The massacre was over in less than a minute. The 7 miners, who had only small knives and tools for defense, stood no chance against the high-caliber rounds. They were cut down where they stood, their bodies falling into the very mud they had been working just moments before. The gunmen then systematically searched the camp, locating the small leather pouches containing the week's gold harvest. They also gathered any equipment that could be salvaged for their boss. To hide the evidence of their crime, the attackers dragged the bodies of Manuel and his crew to a nearby ravine that had been carved out by the hydraulic mining process. They dumped the remains into the deep, muddy pit and used the high-pressure hoses to trigger a small landslide, burying the men under tons of red clay and jungle debris. In the Amazon, a body buried like this can remain hidden for decades, consumed by the rapid decomposition of the tropical heat. The only reason the world eventually learned about the Golden Death was because one of the miners had a younger brother who was waiting for him at the outpost in Itaituba. When the group failed to return for a scheduled supply run, the brother grew suspicious. He knew the risks of the forest, but he also knew Manuel was a veteran who didn't miss appointments. He managed to convince a local bush pilot to fly him over the coordinates of the secret mining claim. From the air, the pilot noticed that the camp looked strangely deserted. The blue tarps were still there, but the water pumps were silent, and there was no smoke from the cooking fire. More disturbingly, he saw that the riverbank had been altered, as if someone had intentionally collapsed a section of the hillside into the ravine. The brother realized immediately that something had gone wrong. He returned to Itaituba and pleaded with the federal police to investigate. Because the year 2000 was a time of increased international pressure regarding Amazonian violence, the federal authorities actually dispatched a small team to the site. When they arrived, they found the camp had been picked clean. However, a forensic team noticed a few spent shell casings that didn't match the typical hunting rifles used by the Garimperos. They began the grueling process of excavating the ravine, eventually discovering the 7 bodies. The investigation led to a series of raids on the land grabbers' main compound, where they found the stolen gold and the weapons used in the attack. The case became a symbol of the green hell violence that defined the turn of the millennium in Brazil. It highlighted the complete absence of federal authority in the interior, where a man's life was worth less than an ounce of gold. The 7 miners were eventually brought back to their villages for a proper burial. The massacre at the gold mine remains a chilling example of how the struggle for natural resources can turn the most beautiful places on Earth into a graveyard. The year 2000 was a period of transition for Brazil, as the government struggled to impose order on a frontier that seemed to resist it at every turn. Manuel and his crew were just 7 names among thousands who disappeared into the green abyss, their dreams of wealth ending in a shallow, muddy pit. While the lawless interior of the Amazon was being stained with the blood of miners, the sophisticated cities of the French Riviera were dealing with a crime that was far more bizarre and disturbing. On the coast of the Mediterranean, in the city of Nice, a different kind of predator was emerging. This individual wasn't interested in gold or land. His obsession was much more visceral, leading him into the quietest and most sacred of places in the dark of night. The transition from the violent, resource-driven massacres of the Brazilian jungle to the quiet, ritualistic desecrations in a French hospital shows the vast spectrum of human darkness in the year 2000. In Nice, the police were about to uncover a secret that would challenge their understanding of modern psychology. A man was about to be caught doing the unthinkable, driven by a thirst that no amount of Mediterranean sunlight could ever hope to quench. As the sun set over the French hospital, a shadow was moving through the corridors, headed toward the basement where the dead were kept in cold storage. The year 2000 was bringing to light a rise in what some called Gothic extremism, but for the investigators in Nice, it was simply a nightmare they had to solve. The discovery of the Vampire of Nice would shock the nation, revealing a man who had completely abandoned his humanity for a jar of blood. The French Riviera, famously known as the Côte d'Azur, is synonymous with high-fashion, luxury yachts. and the shimmering blue of the Mediterranean. In the summer of the year 2000, the city of Nice was bathed in a sweltering warmth that made the nights feel heavy and breathless. While the tourists were crowded into the outdoor cafes along the coast, a very different and much darker activity was taking place in the sterile fluorescent halls of a local clinic. The St. Roch Hospital was a massive complex that never truly slept, but its lowest levels were usually abandoned during the early morning hours. This was where the mortuary was located, a place of steel trays and refrigerated units designed to hold those who had finished their earthly journey. The staff generally avoided the basement, finding the silence and the chill to be unsettling, even for those who had worked in the field of medicine for a very long duration. In early July of 2000, a night watchman named Fabien was performing his final rounds. He noticed that one of the heavy magnetic doors leading to the clinical storage area was slightly ajar. At first, he assumed a technician had been careless with the latch, but as he stepped into the entryway, he detected a strange scent. It wasn't the usual sharp aroma of cleaning solvents. It was something metallic and primal that seemed to hang in the damp, stagnant air. Fabien pushed the door open and clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rows of stainless steel cabinets. In the center of the room, he saw a figure hunched over one of the examination tables. A man in his early 30s, dressed in dark clothing, was focused intently on a body that had been prepared for a post-mortem exam. The man didn't jump or run when the light hit him. He slowly turned his head to look at the guard. The watchman's breath hitched as he saw that the intruder's face was smeared with a dark, wet, sanguine substance. The stranger was holding a small surgical tool in one hand and a plastic cup in the other. He looked at Fabien with a gaze that was disturbingly calm, almost as if he had been interrupted during a mundane chore. Fabien backed out of the room, fumbling for his radio to call for backup, his heart pounding against his ribs in a state of pure adrenaline. Within minutes, the local gendarmerie arrived and took the man into custody. He was identified as a 32-year-old local resident who had no previous history of violent behavior. He didn't resist the arrest, but he refused to answer any questions about why he had broken into the mortuary. The scene he left behind was grotesque. He had accessed several of the deceased individuals, seeking out the vital essence that remained within their cooling veins. The inquiry took an even more terrifying turn when the detectives searched the suspect's apartment located in a quiet neighborhood of Nice. The living space was meticulously cleaned, which made the contents of the kitchen even more jarring for the officers. Inside the pantry, they found dozens of glass canisters, each filled with the same ruby fluid found at the clinic. The suspect had been systematically harvesting and storing this essence for several months. Tucked away in a bedside drawer was a thick, leather-bound volume that served as a chronicle of his internal life. In the year 2000, the diary provided a window into a mind that had completely fractured. He wrote about a process he called the Great Awakening, believing that by consuming the life force of the dead, he could stop his own aging and gain the ability to see through the veil of the physical world. He was obsessed with the idea of becoming eternal. The pages were filled with detailed descriptions of the sensations he experienced after each visit to the hospital. He noted the temperature and the supposed spiritual weight of the fluids he consumed. He believed he was undergoing a physical mutation, claiming that his skin was becoming tougher and his senses were sharpening in the dark. He viewed himself as a pioneer of a new species, an apex nightwalker that lived on the leftovers of the human population. This case sparked a massive debate across France about the rise of extreme subcultures and the influence of certain aesthetics on the mentally fragile. The media labeled him the hematophage of Nice, and the public was fascinated and repulsed by the idea of such a primitive obsession existing in the middle of a modern city. Doctors struggled to categorize his condition, debating whether it was a form of extreme fetishism or a total break from reality. During the legal proceedings in 2000, the suspect remained detached and aloof. He spoke about his actions with a clinical precision that made the lawyers and the jury visibly uncomfortable. He didn't seem to understand the gravity of his desecration, viewing the bodies merely as raw materials for his supposed evolution. He was eventually ordered to be held in a high-security ward for the criminally insane, as he was deemed a threat to public order. The St. Roch Hospital upgraded its security protocols immediately, installing motion sensors and biometric locks on all access points to the mortuary. But for the staff who worked there, the memory of that summer night in 2000 never truly faded. They were left with the knowledge that even in the most secure and scientific environments, the ancient and the macabre can still find a way in, driven by a thirst that defies all modern medical logic. The city of Nice eventually returned to its role as a sunny paradise, but a shadow remained over its medical history. The case became a cautionary tale about the depths of human delusion and the terrifying things that can happen when a person decides to live according to their own dark mythology. While the Mediterranean waves continued to lap against the shore, the secrets of the basement were finally locked away behind heavy steel and constant surveillance. As the French authorities were dealing with this disturbing case of desecration, another type of predator was stalking the transit systems of the East. Thousands of miles away, in the massive, bustling metropolis of Mumbai, India, the year 2000 brought a different kind of fear to the railway tracks. While the man in Nice was hunting the dead in a basement, a very active and dangerous individual was hunting the living on the local train carriages. The local trains in Mumbai are the lifeblood of the city, carrying millions of people in a state of constant, cramped motion. But within those cars, a specific predator had found a way to exploit the unique layout of the railway system. He didn't want life force or spiritual transformation. He wanted power and control over the women who used the transit lines to get home after dark. His presence would eventually lead to a total change in the national safety policy. The transition from the silent mortuaries of the French Riviera to the loud, crowded train compartments of India shows how danger can manifest in any environment. One was a crime of quiet desecration, while the other was a crime of public aggression and terror. In 2000, the predator in Mumbai was about to make a mistake that would finally bring his reign to an end, but not before he had changed the daily lives of millions of travelers forever. The fear that gripped the women of Mumbai was palpable, a constant companion on every late-night journey across the city. They looked under the benches and watched the doors with a level of suspicion that was born from sheer necessity. The story of the railway predator is one of survival and the eventual triumph of a community that refused to be victimized any longer. As the train pulled out of the station, the final hunt of the year 2000 was on. The predator had spent months perfecting his method, learning the schedules and the blind spots of the security staff. He believed he was invisible, a ghost in the machine of the Indian railways. But the year 2000 would prove him wrong, as the authorities and the public combined their efforts to flush him out of the shadows. The transition to this new chapter of the year 2000 would be marked by a surge in vigilance and a demand for justice. In the humid heat of the Mumbai night, the sound of the wheels on the tracks was a rhythmic pulse that matched the heartbeat of the city. But for those on the train, it was a countdown to a potential confrontation. The year 2000 was reaching its climax, and the stories of the year were converging on a single, powerful message, that no matter how dark the intent, the light eventually finds a way to reveal the truth, whether in a morgue or a train. As we move into the heart of the Mumbai mystery, the contrast between the European Riviera and the Indian subcontinent could not be greater. Yet the thread of human darkness remains the same. The railway predator was about to face a reckoning that would echo through the years, proving that the most crowded places can sometimes hide the most dangerous individuals. The stage was set for the final acts of a year that the world would never forget. The predator in Mumbai thought he could hide in plain sight, using the chaos of the crowds as his shield. But the year 2000 was a year where the shadows were finally being erased. As the train sped toward its destination, the final encounter was looming on the horizon. The story of the railway rapist is a testament to the strength of those who fight back, and the transition to the next case would be just as jarring as a sudden stop on the tracks. The investigators in India were already gathering the pieces of a puzzle that had baffled them for months. They were looking for a man who knew the trains better than the engineers, someone who could vanish into a crowd of thousands in a matter of seconds. The year 2000 was a turning point for the city, a year where the safety of the public became the primary focus of every government agency, leading to a massive overhaul of the laws. The impact of these events was felt far beyond the borders of Mumbai, as other cities around the world began to look at their own transit systems with a new level of scrutiny. The year 2000 was a global wake-up call, a year where the vulnerability of the modern traveler was exposed for all to see. The Predator on the Tracks was a reminder that even in our most connected era, we are never truly alone, and the danger can be standing right next to us. As the sun began to rise over the Arabian Sea, the city of Mumbai was already stirring, a sea of humanity moving toward the railway stations. The fear was still there, but it was being replaced by a sense of determination. The story of the year 2000 was far from over, and the final chapters would be written in the sweat of those who refused to let the darkness win. The transition to the next story was about to begin on the railway platform. The city of Mumbai is a sprawling, humid giant that lives and breathes through its massive suburban transit network. Every single day, over 7 million souls are funneled through the narrow doorways of the rolling stock, creating a phenomenon known as the super-dense crush load. In the year 2000, the primary lifeline for the working population was the Western Line, a series of iron pathways that connected the northern residential zones to the southern commercial hubs. For women traveling in this metropolitan chaos, the authorities had designated specific carriages known as the ladies' specials. These were meant to be sanctuaries, spaces where female travelers could find a reprieve from the overwhelming physical pressure of the general compartments. They were painted with distinctive stripes and icons to signify their status. However, as the clock ticked past midnight in the year 2000, these safe havens were transformed into a hunting ground. The terror began with a series of reports from women who had been traveling alone on the late-night services. A nurse named Sunita was heading home toward the Borivali terminus after a double shift. The carriage was almost empty, with only the rhythmic clicking of the wheels and the whirring of the rusted ceiling fans to keep her company. As the transit vehicle slowed down for a minor signal halt in a darkened stretch of the marshlands, she heard a faint rustle from below. Sunita looked down at the wooden slats of the bench opposite her, but the shadows were too thick to see anything clearly. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the gap beneath the seat and gripped her ankle with a strength that felt like a metal vice. She screamed, kicking frantically as a man slid out from the cramped crawl space like a serpent emerging from a hole. He had been hiding there for hours, biding his time until the carriage was sufficiently isolated for his strike. The Prowler was agile and possessed an intimate knowledge of the transit layout. He didn't use a blade or a heavy tool. He relied on the element of surprise and the sheer isolation of the nighttime journey. In Sunita's case, she managed to strike him with her heavy bag and leap toward the emergency alarm chain, but the assailant was already moving toward the open doorway. As the vehicle began to accelerate, he simply stepped out into the darkness and vanished. By the middle of the year 2000, several similar incidents had been reported across the suburban network. The offender seemed to favor the sections of the line where the locomotives had to slow down due to ongoing maintenance or signal issues. These were the blind spots of the system, places where the lighting was poor and the surrounding terrain was thick with industrial debris and overgrown weeds. The women of Mumbai began to feel a deep sense of dread. The investigation was a logistical nightmare for the local constabulary. The Mumbai suburban network has hundreds of stops and thousands of miles of fencing that is easily breached. Trying to find one specific individual among millions of daily travelers was like looking for a single grain of sand in a desert. The authorities increased the number of plainclothes officers on the platforms, but the creeper was smart enough to avoid any area with a visible patrol presence. The break in the case finally arrived in the late monsoon season of 2000. A young student was traveling on the slow line when she noticed a man lingering near the coupling between two carriages. Unlike the other travelers who were eager to board, this man was watching the ladies' special with a focused, predatory intensity. He waited until the very last second before the wheels began to turn, and then he hoisted himself up with the grace of a professional acrobat. The student alerted the authorities at the next major hub, providing a detailed description of his clothing and his physical build. The constables launched a coordinated sweep of the line, utilizing a network of informants who lived in the shanty towns bordering the iron rails. They discovered that the suspect was a man who had worked as a casual laborer on the rail maintenance crews years prior, which explained how he knew exactly where to hide and when to jump. When the Prowler was finally apprehended in late 2000, he was found to be carrying a collection of personal items that had been reported missing by his various victims. He had kept these trinkets as a way to commemorate his successful strikes, similar to the way a hunter might display a trophy. His confession during the interrogation revealed a chilling lack of remorse. He viewed the women as targets in a game of stealth that he had been winning for months. The trial in the year 2000 became a lightning rod for public outrage regarding women's safety on mass transit. The courtrooms were packed with activists and concerned citizens who demanded that the government take immediate action to protect those who had no choice but to travel late at night. The proceedings highlighted the fact that the sanctuary of the ladies' special was an illusion if there was no one there to actually enforce the safety of the perimeter. In response to the conviction, the Indian Railways enacted a historic policy change that remains a cornerstone of transit safety today. They deployed the Railway Protection Force, an armed unit of guards, to occupy the female-only coaches during the night shifts. These officers were tasked with sweeping the underside of the benches before every departure and standing guard at the doorways during every stop. The era of the unchecked prowler had finally come to an end. The legacy of the Mumbai railway case in the year 2000 is one of systemic reform. It forced the nation to confront the vulnerability of its citizens in the spaces that were supposed to be secure. The sound of the wheels on the iron rails still echoes through the city today. But for the millions of women who board the night services, the presence of the uniformed guards provides a level of peace that was once thought to be impossible to achieve in the chaos. The transition from the crowded, humid transit lines of India to the cold, pristine banks of Lake Geneva shows that the geography of crime is vast. While the people of Mumbai were reclaiming their sense of safety on the rails, the Swiss authorities were facing a mystery that would emerge from the depths of one of Europe's most beautiful bodies of water. This wasn't a crime of public aggression, but a calculated, professional hit involving the global elite. In the autumn of the year 2000, a piece of luggage washed ashore near a high-end promenade in Geneva. It wasn't filled with clothing or holiday souvenirs. Instead, it contained the dismembered remains of a man who had been a titan in the world of international finance. The discovery would peel back the layers of a global money laundering scheme, revealing that even in the most peaceful and wealthy corners of the earth, the darkness is never far. As the Swiss investigators began to piece together the identity of the man in the suitcase, they realized they were dealing with a level of sophistication that made local crimes look like child's play. The year 2000 was drawing to a close, but the secrets hidden beneath the surface of the lake were just beginning to be told. The final story of this global journey would take us into the heart of a financial conspiracy that ended in a cold, silent grave. The expansive waters of Lake Leman, known more widely as Lake Geneva, provide a staggering backdrop of alpine peaks and pristine icy shores that reflect the wealth of Switzerland. In the month of October, during the year 2000, the local climate was shifting into a biting chill that turned the morning fog into a thick gray blanket over the surface of the lake. It was a landscape that whispered of old money, absolute discretion, and the clinical efficiency of the Swiss elite. Along the stony promenade near the district of Vessenaz, a morning jogger was making his way through the mist on October 18, 2000. He was a local accountant who prized the order and predictability of his routine. As he rounded a curve where the reeds grow thick near the shoreline, he noticed a large, dark object bobbing rhythmically against the rocks. At first, he assumed it was a piece of discarded industrial refuse or perhaps a stray piece of boat timber. As he drew closer, however, the jogger realized that the item was far too elegant to be trash. It was a massive, rectangular trunk made of expensive, dark brown leather with heavy brass fittings that gleamed even in the low light of the autumn dawn. It looked like the kind of luxury luggage one would see in a first-class cabin on a transatlantic voyage. It was out of place in the reeds, and it appeared to be weighted down, sitting very low in the freezing water. The man climbed down the slippery rocks and gripped the leather handle, attempting to pull the object toward the dry path. He was shocked by the sheer mass of the trunk. It felt as though it were filled with wet sand or heavy stones. After a significant struggle, he managed to haul it onto the gravel. A faint, cloying scent began to emanate from the seams of the leather, a smell that was sharp and metallic, clashing with the fresh alpine air of the morning. The jogger decided not to open the brass latches himself. He reached for his mobile phone and contacted the cantonal authorities, reporting a suspicious find on the banks of the lake. Within 20 minutes, a team of inspectors from the Geneva Commissariat arrived at the scene. They shared the jogger's initial confusion. Why would someone discard a piece of luggage worth thousands of Swiss francs in such a remote and unceremonious fashion near the water? Using a specialized tool, the lead inspector popped the primary lock of the leather trunk. As the lid creaked open, the seasoned officers instinctively stepped back, shielding their faces from the sudden waft of stagnant air. Inside, wrapped in several layers of thick industrial film, were the dismembered remnants of a human being. The work was not the result of a frantic struggle or a crime of passion. The sections had been separated with a surgical precision. The victim was eventually identified as Hans-Peter, a 58-year-old financier who held a senior position at one of the most prestigious investment firms in Zurich. He had been a man of immense influence, navigating the complex world of international wealth management with an opaque, guarded demeanor. Hans-Peter had vanished exactly 9 days prior, after leaving his office for what his secretary assumed was a routine lunch meeting at a private gentleman's club. The vanishing of such a high-profile figure in the Swiss financial sector had been kept quiet by the Zurich officials to avoid causing a tremor in the markets. Hans-Peter lived in a high-security penthouse apartment that utilized biometric scanners and a dedicated concierge. When the cantonal officers searched his residence, they found absolutely no signs of a struggle. His gold watch was on the nightstand, and his favorite fountain pen was still resting on his desk. It was as if the man had simply been plucked out of his existence by a force that knew every single blind spot in his security detail. As the forensic teams examined the leather trunk, they discovered that it had been manufactured by a bespoke boutique in Milan. Through the serial numbers on the brass fittings, they were able to trace the purchase to a buyer in Eastern Europe who had used a series of shell companies and offshore accounts to hide his true identity. The investigation soon revealed a dark underbelly to Hans-Peter's professional life. He had been managing the assets of several powerful syndicates that were looking to move billions of dollars through the Swiss banking system to avoid international oversight. It appeared that Hans-Peter had discovered a massive discrepancy in the ledger, a hole in the accounts that suggested someone within the syndicate was siphoning off funds for a private mercenary operation. In the world of high-stakes finance, knowing a secret of that magnitude is a death sentence. The authorities hypothesized that a team of professional mercenaries had been hired to eliminate the financier and send a message to anyone else who might consider looking too closely at the books. These were men who operated like ghosts, crossing the borders of the Alpine nation with ease and utilizing specialized equipment to bypass the most advanced security systems. The homicide was executed with a level of cold, professional detachment that horrified the Swiss investigators. Hans-Peter had likely been neutralized in his own home before being transported in the very trunk that would eventually become his coffin. The killers had then taken a small, private boat out into the center of Lake Geneva under the cover of a moonless night, intending for the heavy leather trunk to sink into the deep, dark trenches of the lake bed. However, the mercenaries had made a single, critical error. They had not accounted for the specific currents of the lake during the autumn transition, nor had they punctured the industrial film enough to allow the air to escape. Instead of sinking to the bottom, the trunk had drifted slowly toward the Vessinage shoreline, eventually being caught in the reeds where it waited for the morning jogger to find it. The Alpine waters had refused to keep the secret. The case of the financier in the trunk became a watershed moment for the Swiss authorities in the year 2000. It highlighted the fact that the neutrality and secrecy of the banking sector provided a perfect veil for global criminals to operate. The story was a grim reminder that in the shadow of the beautiful mountains, a different kind of war was being fought, with ledger sheets and surgical steel, where the cost of a mistake was measured in human lives. By the end of the year 2000, several arrests were made in connection with the money laundering scheme, though the actual individuals who had handled the blade were never apprehended. They had vanished back across the border, leaving behind only the expensive leather luggage and the remnants of a man who knew too much. The shores of Lake Leman remained tranquil and picturesque, but the image of the trunk in the reeds lingered in the public mind. This concludes tonight's episode. 13 stories. 13 moments that should never have happened. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. I will see you next time. Stay safe out there.